Welcome to another how-to video from my YouTube channel, Razor's Edge. So what would have me out here in the 100-degree heat working on my razor? Well, I've just installed a pair of rear axles. They are Rhino brand from SuperATV. They look really good, don't they? But I'm getting a little ahead of myself. This is a how-to video. So let me back this up and show you how I installed them. Alright, so we got the machine blocked up, got it secured so it's not going to fall. Went ahead and removed the tires. The first thing we're going to do is remove this cotter pin from the axle shaft. That's actually the axle shaft sticking right out the end here. We're going to remove that cotter pin and then remove the hub castle nut off the axle. That will allow us to remove this hub assembly off the axle. We'll take a pair of needle nose pliers, get a hold of the end of that cotter pin, just bend it around, line it up with the hole. If you end up with a stubborn one that doesn't want to come out, one way to get it is take a punch, tap it into the hole, and then use the punch and a small hammer and drive it out of the shaft itself. And out it comes. Now the next step is to remove this castle nut off the axle shaft here. This is a 1 1/16 inch socket that fits it. There's about 110 pounds of torque on it, so try not to injure yourself trying to break that thing loose. And one thing to note is if your axle is actually broken, you won't have anything to hold this hub from spinning when you're trying to loosen this nut. You can get somebody to sit in the machine and hold the brakes for you. That could work. Or you can get a piece of pipe or something and put between the lugs here. Just make sure your nuts are on the lugs so you don't mess the threads up on the lugs, and wedge it against the ground as you're trying to break it loose. Impact wrench usually will pop it loose without having to do any of that, so if you got access to that, that's even better. Now, I do have an impact wrench, but I'm just gonna pop it loose with my little trusty pull handle here. It's not that hard, and it should just thread right off. Now you won't be reusing this nut. The new axles come with one, but there are a couple of cone washers in here that you will be reusing, so be careful not to lose these. The next step is to go ahead and remove this bolt from the upper control arm here, and we'll get it up and out of the way. This is a 15 millimeter. It's got about 40 pounds of torque on it. Not too difficult to remove. We're got a 15 millimeter socket with a ratchet and a 15 millimeter box in, and just going to loosen it up with that, and then take my trusty air ratchet and zip it on off. You should be able to wiggle this around and get that bolt to come out, but if it's being stubborn, just gently tap it. If you have to hit it any harder than that, put the nut back on this side and hit the nut so you don't damage the threads on the bolt. Alright, with the bolt out, you can raise this control arm and get it up out of your way. What I'm actually going to do is, I got a piece of string here. I'm just going to loop it over the arm and then tie it up there on the body to keep it up and out of the way. Alright, now chances are on your machine you still have a rear sway bar. I do not. I took mine off. Just for the type of riding I do, it's better not to have one, and I don't really ride fast enough to need it, but it will be attached here. Now, even if you don't have aftermarket A-arms, the connections are still all going to be in the same location. So you'll have a 50 millimeter bolt here holding the sway bar on, and it probably will be in the way of taking this axle out. So what you want to do at this point is go to the other side, repeat these steps, and when you get to this point, go ahead and take the sway bar loose on both sides, and then raise it and roll it up and out of the way as well, and secure it with, again, some string, bungee cord, whatever. Alright, there are a couple different ways to do this. The long way around, and really the best way if you're checking out this entire assembly, is to remove the brake caliper and then that will allow you to take the hub and the rotor assembly and slide it out of the bearing carrier and off the axle shaft. And then you can remove the bottom bolt from the lower control arm and remove the bearing carrier off the axle shaft, and that will leave the axle just completely exposed and free on this end. If you're changing the wheel bearings, that would be what you'd have to do. If you're not going to change the wheel bearings and your brake pads are okay, you're not worried about any of this, you can just remove this bottom bolt and remove this entire assembly off the axle shaft. And that's what I'm actually going to do. Now what you want to do is you can roll this down a little bit and then tap gently on the end of the axle shaft to make sure it is free from the bearing inside. As you can see, some of one of the cone washers fell out. There goes the other one. We'll set them off to the side because we're going to reuse those. Now I'm going to go ahead and remove this lower control arm bolt so I can just pull this assembly off the shaft. Alright, this lower bolt is actually an 18 millimeter. So I got my boxing wrench, I got my ratchet socket. It's got a little bit more torque on it. Alright, this bolt is free, so I don't need to drive it out, but if it was a little more jammed up than that, this is what I was talking about. You leave the nut on the end of it, that way when you tap on the bolt, you're tapping on the nut itself and you're not damaging the threads on it. I'll go ahead and pull that out. Now you want to catch your hub assembly here because it will come crashing down or make some sort of ruckus, you can be assured. Alright, now that it is free, all we have to do is lift it off the axle shaft. Alright, so you don't want to leave this assembly just hanging here by the brake line. You could damage it, pinch it, chafe it up against the little clamps that hold it in place. So what I'm going to do is just set it right up here on the control arm. Now to get the axle out is a relatively simple process, but every time I say that it becomes a problem. You should be able to just pull this axle, and when it bottoms out there's a little clip in there that's holding it in the rear differential. So all you have to do is just kind of give it a sharp tug and it should pop right out. Of course this one doesn't, and every time I say that, that's what happens. Alright, I finally tugged it hard enough to get it out. As you can see, this spline is all rusty. This is the little clip that holds it in. Everything's rusted up. When we go to put the new axle in, we're going to grease this good with a nice waterproof grease. That'll help prevent this from happening. And even periodically, when you do maintenance on the machines, it's not a bad idea to pull the axles out and re-grease these splines just to keep this from happening. Alright, so here's a little bit of a side-by-side comparison of my new SuperATV Rhino axle next to the factory axle I just removed. The shaft size is about the same, but this shaft is actually chrome moly. The boots on these Rhino axles are a heavier, thicker, stiffer material. These are pretty soft and spongy and they're easily punctured. These axles, the CV joints, are designed to run at higher angles, which is great if you have lift kits. They have a greater range of motion. Very nice products. I've had them in both of my previous razors, and I've broken the factory axle shaft. I have yet to break a Rhino axle shaft, so that's why they're going in. Alright, before we put the new axle in, if you can see down that hole, it's rusted. It's kind of gross looking. You can see the end of the other axle on the other side over there, possibly. I'm going to clean that out a little bit before I put some grease in it. what I've got is a rag here that's soaked in WD-40. You don't want to put any harsh chemical in here because you don't want to damage this oil seal. So I'm just gonna take my rag here, soaked with WD-40, and wipe them splines out and remove some of the rust. I have some green grease here. I'm just gonna get a little bit on my finger and reach up in there and smear it around inside that spline. There you go, with me a little bit more. I'm gonna go ahead and rub it into the spline on the end of the axle that goes into the rear differential. Right now we just want to reinsert it. Just turn it till it lines up and do the opposite. Just push on it and give it a little sharp tap until it sticks. There we go. It won't come out, so that end is in place. Alright, before reassembling all this, I got me another rag here soaked with a little bit of some mineral spirits. I'm going to clean out the pivot points on the arms, the pivots on the hubs, and just kind of get some of the old grease and gunk removed from all this before I reassemble it. Another area you want to clean out is the spline inside this hub. You get some of the grit and the grease out of it, and that the old grease. This is actually supposed to be greased as well when it's reassembled. So right now I'm just going to clean it out, and then we'll grease it and the spline on the axle shaft before we reassemble it. Also carefully wipe down these faces right here of the hub and the bearing, because that's what actually rides on the axle shaft. Alright, got another dab of my green grease here. Let's go ahead and wipe it around inside the spline. Go ahead and remove your castle nut and washer from the end of this axle shaft. And then we'll wipe some grease on this spline as well. Alright, so all we have to do now is take this hub assembly and guide it onto the axle, line up the spline, reinsert it into the lower control arm, insert the bolt, and that's halfway together right there. I'm going to go ahead and unhook my upper control arm. Get it into place. Insert this bolt. Alright, we'll go ahead and put the washers and the nuts back on these bolts too. And then take the air ratchet, snug it up. Now typically I have found that this axle shaft is actually a slightly bit longer than the factory one. You double check your spacing, but what I have found in the past is using all 3 washers is exactly what it needs. Now these are cone washers. They're not flat. If you put them together like this, you see the edges won't even touch. So make sure you get them in both in the same direction. Stack them with the cone washer that came with the axle, and then put those on the shaft along with the castle nut. That way when you tighten it down, your hole will be lined up with the teeth in this castle nut for your cotter pin to go through. Right now we just want to take up the slack, get the play out of it. Alright, we're starting to get tight, and as you can see, the hole lines up exactly with these teeth so the spacing is correct. Now we just want to torque this castle nut down, and as I said before, that's 110 foot-pounds. Alright, so I got my torque wrench here set at 110 pounds. Just gonna torque this castle nut down, and the machine being in park obviously is going to keep it from rotating. And what you want to do is see how lined up the hole is with the teeth in this castle nut, and I managed to land right dead on it. So if this did not line up with any of these gaps, tighten the nut up a little further. Don't use your torque wrench, you could damage it by over tightening past the torque. To take your pull handle and tighten this castle nut up a little further until you get room for the cotter pin. Right now it's time to put the cotter pins back in. The axles do come with new cotter pins. They should be taped inside the box. Look for them carefully. But I'm going to have to replace my wheel bearings soon, so I'm not going to reuse the new ones now. I'll just put these old ones back in for the time being. I'll use the new ones when I take it back apart for the wheel bearings. Just use your needle nose pliers, grab the end of this pin and kind of wrap it around the nut to keep it from backing out. Alright, so we're almost done here. The last couple steps here, we need to torque this bolt. This bolt is 42 foot-pounds. This is an M10. The bottom bolt on this machine is an M12. That is 40 foot-pounds plus a 180-degree turn. Now, some razors, I think especially the 2-seat 900s, will have the same size bolt upper and lower. So double check that. If your 15 millimeter fits the upper and lower bolt, then you tighten it to 42. If you have to have an 18 millimeter for the bottom, you tighten it 40 foot-pounds plus another 180-degree turn. When you tighten these two up, you go ahead and do your other side just like this, and then when both sides are complete, then you reattach your sway bar. Now this bolt is also 40 foot-pounds on both sides, so you'll just reattach that, torque it to 40 pounds, and then you're done. So I'm going to go ahead and tighten these up. Now these, because they're stop nuts, you won't get an exact click every time, so just push it a little bit further each time as you click it until it doesn't want to move anymore. And then we'll move to the lower one. Alright, I put me a little short extension on here, give me some room to work. I'm going to go ahead and torque that lower bolt to its 40 pounds. Alright. There it is. Now it calls for another 180-degree turn. Now that gets pretty tight. I'm going to go ahead and tell you what I'm going to do. Take the torque wrench off so I don't damage it. Use my pull handle here. Get it pointed as far down, close to being down as I can. I'm going to do two 90-degree turns. So there's one. I got to do another one. Okay. Now them are torqued. So as I said before, go ahead and do your other side. Reattach your sway bar after both axles are in, and then put your wheel back on. Now these, on this particular model, because of the size of the lugs, these torque to 120 pounds. And then you're ready for your test ride. Alright, real quick, I want to show you something that happened when I was removing the Polaris axle from this side of the vehicle, getting ready to put in the Rhino axle. I pulled on the axle and bumped it like you would to remove it from the housing, and it literally just came apart in my hands. The upper end of the axle, the transmission end, was still left stuck in the differential housing, and there's no real way to get a hold of it to get it to pull out, especially with the kind of force it takes to get it out, with it being kind of rusted and corroded from lack of grease. I had to go around and take the other side apart, stick a bar through the center of the differential and to the back side of this axle spline, and hit it with a hammer to knock this side out. And then I had to put that side back together so that I can come back and put this side back together. So heads up, just in case this happens to you, that's a good way to get it out. All I can say is these Rhino axles showed up just in the nick of time, apparently. Okay, so both rear axles are installed. Naturally, being SuperATV's Rhino brand, they look good, they fit good. Now, I do have a couple other projects going on with this machine, so I haven't had a chance to take it out and hammer on it just yet. I keep an eye open for a product review video on these axles after I've had a chance to get it all back together and take it out for a spin. I'd like to thank SuperATV for making such awesome aftermarket upgrades for our vehicles. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you on the trails.